This video discusses recent political party trends in California. In particular, we're going to look at the increase in independent voters in California, as well as the increasing dominance of the Democratic Party in recent elections in the state. When we look at voter registration in California, a few things are important to note. The state has nearly 20 million registered voters, which represents over 79% of all those who are legally eligible to vote in the state. That represents an increase of several percentage points in just the last 5 years. And most of the recent increase in registered voters is accounted for by the rise of independents, that is, people who indicate no party preference when they register to vote. Independents made up only 14% of the state's voters in the year 2000, but they have doubled as a share of the electorate by 2019, now making up 28% of the state's registered voters. Most of the increase in independents has come at the expense of the Republican Party, as its share of registered voters has slipped from 35% in the year 2000 to 24% in 2019. Democrats have also lost ground, but not nearly as severely, slipping from 45% in 2000 to 43% in 2019. The story these trends tell is that in a relatively short time, politically speaking, California has gone from a Democratic-leaning state to a Democratic-dominant state. In theory, the Republican Party could still compete in the state by winning over independent voters. However, independents in California tend to lean more closely to the Democratic Party than to the Republicans. This has had some pretty dire consequences for Republican fortunes in California in recent elections. The increasing relative advantage of the Democratic Party in California is a product of each party's coalition, the societal groups that each party more strongly appeals to. For decades, the Democratic Party has appealed more strongly to racial and ethnic minorities, and that advantage is only growing. As California has become increasingly diverse, this has accrued to the Democratic Party's advantage. In a state in which Latinos are the largest ethnic group, the Republican Party has seen its fortunes suffer as its coalition is made up overwhelmingly by white voters. Just as in the country more broadly, women in California have increasingly shifted their leaning toward the Democratic Party in recent years. Also reflecting national trends, younger voters, especially millennials and Generation Z, are much more likely to identify themselves as Democrats than as Republicans. And Democrats have consolidated support in the state's more densely populated coastal areas, which happen to be where nearly all the state's population growth is occurring. The Republican Party in California faces severe challenges because its coalition simply isn't broad enough to compete statewide. While white voters in the state are more likely to identify as Republican than as Democrat, it's a pretty narrow difference. In other words, white voters in California are much less Republican-leaning than they are in the nation as a whole. There are similar trends by gender and age. While Republicans in California do relatively better among men and older voters, two demographic groups that are key to their success nationally, in California, Democrats still win a plurality of the male and senior citizen vote. Only in Republican strongholds in the Sierras and Inland Empire is the national trend of Republican strength in less densely populated communities mirrored in California. To compete in the future, the Republican Party of California will need to find ways to broaden their appeal to the younger and more diverse residents of the state. While the Democratic Party has enjoyed an electoral advantage over Republicans for decades in California, it's the extent of that advantage that's grown enormously in just the past decade. Until 2010, Republicans competed pretty successfully in statewide elected offices. The administrations of Ronald Reagan, George Deukmejian, Pete Wilson, and Arnold Schwarzenegger gave Republicans control of California's governorship for 31 out of 44 years, from 1996 through 2010. So an overwhelming majority of the time in those decades. But in recent years, Democrats have dominated statewide elections. Democratic candidates have won every statewide elected office since the 2010 elections. This includes the high-profile positions of governor and U.S. senator, as well as state executive branch positions like attorney general, secretary of state, and lieutenant governor. Currently, Democrats occupy all 8 elected statewide executive branch offices. While Democrats have held a majority of both chambers of the state legislature since the mid-1990s, they've recently increased their advantage to the point where they now hold supermajorities, with 61 out of 80 seats in the State House of Representatives and 29 out of 40 seats in the state Senate belonging to members of the Democratic Party. This gives California Democrats overwhelming power to shape the legislative agenda at the state capitol. In terms of members of Congress from California, Democrats now hold 46 out of the state's 53 seats in the United States House of Representatives. As recently as the year 2000, there was a relatively even balance, with 27 Democrats and 25 Republicans from California being sent by voters to Washington, D.C. But recent elections have reshaped the electoral map in the state, as Democrats took over seats in former Republican strongholds in Orange County, San Diego, and the Central Valley, leaving California Republicans with only 7 seats in the U.S. House. Lastly, California's 2 U.S. senators have both been Democrats, going back as far as the 1992 elections. One way of understanding the enormous partisan shift in California toward the Democratic Party in recent years is to take a look at the state's vote in the presidential elections, comparing the year 2000 and the year 2016. These visualizations of the state vote broken down by county come from the U.S. Elections Atlas. And if you follow politics somewhat closely, you might notice that the color schemes may seem a little counterintuitive to you, because they use the red shaded areas to represent counties that voted for the Democratic candidate, and the blue shaded areas represent counties that gave more votes to the Republican candidate. So in the year 2000, when the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, narrowly won the Electoral College, California voters supported the Democrat, Al Gore, by a 12% margin. But as you can see, if you look carefully at how the vote was distributed within the state, the Republican candidate, Bush, still carried a majority in some of the state's heavily populated areas, including Orange County, San Diego, Ventura, Riverside, San Bernardino, and most of the Central Valley. But by the 2016 election, when the Democrat Hillary Clinton carried the state by 30 percentage points over Republican Donald Trump, all the coastal counties in Southern California had switched to the Democratic column, as well as much of the Central Valley and Inland Empire. While there is still a fair amount of blue on the 2016 map, these counties are much, much more sparsely populated than the counties shaded in red. These graphics are just one way of telling the story of the Democratic Party's recent dominance in the state. From a political science perspective, the interesting questions moving forward are about how one-party dominance shapes the politics of the state. So will Democrats, for instance, manage their coalition effectively, or will there be intense infighting within the party? And how does the Republican Party of California chart a long-term course toward recovery? Can they find a way to appeal to California's diverse electorate at a time when national Republicans appear to be alienating young and minority voters?